At 3:38 p.m. on February 27, 2026, according to the scenario laid out by U.S. military sources, President Donald Trump gave the final authorization to Central Command for an operation that would immediately redraw the map of military deterrence in the Middle East and send shockwaves through every defense ministry in the world. The order was brief, final, and unmistakable. Operation Epic Fury approved. Within hours, that decision moved from the command chain to the front line, where crews aboard U.S. Navy warships in the region prepared for one of the most concentrated opening salvos in modern conventional warfare. Just after midnight, inside the Combat Information Center of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, USS Michael Murphy, sailors watched their screens in near silence, aware that once the order was executed, there would be no gradual escalation, no symbolic exchange, but a direct and overwhelming strike designed to blind, decapitate, and paralyze the Islamic Republic's military infrastructure in a matter of minutes. When the first Mk-41 vertical launch silo opened and a BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missile tore into the night, that silence ended. Seconds later, another followed, then another, and another, as the destroyer emptied salvo after salvo toward targets inside Iran. In less than 2 minutes, the USS Mitchell joined the strike package, adding more cruise missiles to an attack designed not merely to punish, but to dismantle. By then, Operation Epic Fury was no longer a plan on paper. It was underway. Long before the first missile crossed the Iranian coast, however, the opening phase of the operation had already begun in a domain with no visible explosions and no televised images. In the hours preceding the launch, U.S. Cyber Command is described as having unleashed a coordinated offensive against Iranian military communications, command systems, and air defense networks, flooding them with malicious traffic, false signals, and algorithmic disruptions intended to blind operators at the exact moment they believed they were most alert. The objective was not simply to disrupt a few radars, it was to compromise the country's integrated ability to understand what was happening to it. Iranian early warning crews along the Gulf Coast may have believed they were monitoring the airspace, but according to the account, they were already operating inside a distorted battlespace in which data was unreliable, command links were degraded, and defensive reaction times were collapsing. That cyber offensive set the conditions for the next stage, the approach of Tomahawk cruise missiles flying only meters above the waters of the Gulf, using terrain masking, the curvature of the Earth, and the reduced radar horizon to remain hidden for as long as possible. Subsonic but precise, GPS-guided and programmed for separate target sets, the missiles reportedly moved toward naval installations, coastal batteries, and key infrastructure nodes intended to be destroyed before manned aircraft entered contested airspace. Those missiles were not fast, and that mattered. Flying at roughly 880 kilometers per hour, Tomahawks give defenders time if defenders can see them. The risk for U.S. commanders was clear. Every minute in flight was a minute in which the strike could be detected, intercepted, or partially blunted. But roughly 40 minutes after launch, the first wave began arriving over target areas, and the effect, according to the scenario, was devastating. At Bushehr, facilities associated with the Revolutionary Maritime Guard and its fast attack boat fleet were hit with what is described as surgical precision, reducing key assets to wreckage almost instantly. Farther east, at the strategic port of Chabahar, a Jamaran-class corvette reportedly took multiple direct hits and sank in the harbor. The timing was deliberate and politically loaded. The strikes came in broad daylight, at approximately 9:45 a.m. in Tehran, violating the traditional preference for darkness in opening attacks and sending a message as much psychological as military. The United States was not merely attacking, it was doing so openly, visibly, and with apparent confidence that Iranian defenses could not prevent it. As fires spread along the Gulf Coast, the operation expanded vertically and geographically. More than 100 aircraft reportedly launched from the carriers Lincoln and Ford, including fighters tasked with air superiority, suppression of enemy air defenses, and electronic warfare. Yet even that was not the heaviest blow. The most consequential strike in the entire operation was said to have come from a B-2 Spirit strategic bomber on an intercontinental mission launched from U.S. territory. Flying at approximately 12,000 meters, after hours in the air, the bomber reached its release point above the mountain shielding Natanz, the underground uranium enrichment complex that has long stood at the center of international concerns over Iran's nuclear program. From its weapons bay, the aircraft released a massive ordnance penetrator, a 13,600-kilogram bunker-busting weapon engineered not to explode on impact, but to burrow through layers of rock and reinforce construction before detonating deep inside hardened underground spaces. The bomb's fuse is described as using acceleration and deceleration data to determine how many protective layers it has passed through, exploding only after it has penetrated into the core of a buried facility. In operational terms, the intent was unmistakable: destroy not just buildings, but the protected architecture of Iran's nuclear effort itself. At the same time, the political nerve center of the Iranian state came under direct attack. According to the account, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had convened a Defense Council meeting at the Pasteur Street compound in central Tehran, despite the rapidly worsening military situation. That decision, if accurately reflected in the chain of events described, placed the regime's core leadership under one roof at the worst possible moment. Precision-guided bunker-busting munitions then struck the compound. The presidential complex reportedly suffered immediate structural collapse, and Khamenei, the dominant figure in Iranian politics for decades, was described as definitively neutralized in the first phase of the campaign. If true, the consequences would be incalculable. The strike would not simply remove a head of state. It would sever the central chain of ideological, political, and military authority in a system built around personal control, clerical legitimacy, and layered command. For Pentagon planners, this would represent a textbook decapitation strike. For the region, however, it would open the door to something more dangerous: fragmentation. That danger became apparent almost immediately. Destroying central leadership does not automatically end war. In some cases, it multiplies it. With the supreme leadership and senior decision-makers reportedly killed or cut off, commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps scattered across western Iran and elsewhere suddenly found themselves armed, enraged, and without restraint. Hundreds of officers controlling solid-fuel missile units, underground depots, and mobile launchers were now in a battle space where normal supervision had collapsed. No orders, no chain of command, no political break. The very success of the decapitation created the conditions for a retaliatory response that was less coordinated but potentially more reckless. That raised the question of how Iran's dense air defense network had failed so completely in the opening phase. The answer, according to the operational description, lay in a mix of mass deception and electromagnetic warfare. In the minutes before and during the main air assault, U.S. forces reportedly flooded Iranian airspace with large numbers of low-cost kamikaze drones known as Lucas, the low-cost, uncrewed combat attack system. The symbolism was sharp. These drones were described as reverse-engineered copies of Iran's own Shahed 136 design, but produced by the American company Spectral Labs and deployed back against the originator of the concept. With a range of about 800 kilometers and an 18-kilogram warhead, each drone cost a fraction of the price of the interceptor missiles Iran was forced to use against them. This was asymmetric warfare turned against its author. Iranian crews operating Russian and Chinese-made air defense systems suddenly faced swarms of cheap, expendable targets that compelled them to expend expensive interceptors just to keep the sky from filling with incoming threats. But the drones were not the main strike weapon. They were bait. The real offensive moved through the invisible layer of the spectrum. High above, EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft worked in coordination with Israeli F-35I stealth fighters, equipped, according to the text, with advanced Scorpius electronic warfare pods. Together, they generated such intense spectral interference that Iranian sensors reportedly lost the ability to separate genuine low-signature aircraft from the storm of electromagnetic noise around them. Systems such as the HQ-9B and the Russian S-400, presented for years as credible counters to Western air power, were allegedly overwhelmed, their processors unable to maintain reliable target tracks in the face of broad-spectrum jamming, saturation, and stealth penetration. In that degraded environment, American aircraft launched AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles against emitting radars and air defense nodes, further punching holes in Iran's ability to see, track, and respond. The result was a temporary but decisive collapse of the country's protective shield. Yet, that collapse did not produce surrender. It produced retaliation. With naval assets burning, nuclear infrastructure under attack, and top leadership reportedly dead, surviving Revolutionary Guard commanders initiated what they called Operation True Promise 4, a broad retaliatory missile campaign aimed not only at U.S. forces in the Gulf, but also at allied Arab states and Israel. The weapons prepared for launch included Fateh 110 family tactical missiles, Zulfiqar and Khaybar Shakan systems, and most significantly, the Fatah and Fatah II, described here as hypersonic or quasi-hypersonic weapons, equipped with maneuverable glide or re-entry capabilities. Unlike classic ballistic missiles that follow a more predictable arc, these systems were portrayed as able to shift trajectory at extreme speeds, complicating interception calculations for defensive systems such as Patriot and Arrow 3. In practical terms, the strategy was saturation. Launch from multiple vectors, route threats across several allied countries' airspace, and force the regional missile defense architecture to engage too many targets at once. Soon, that is exactly what happened. Across U.S. destroyers, land bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, and Israeli command centers, tactical displays reportedly filled with red tracks. Alarm sirens began sounding across the Gulf. For all the scale and sophistication of the opening American blow, Allied crews now confronted a simple and terrifying fact. There were too many missiles in the air. The defensive shield held, but not cleanly. Interceptors destroyed the majority of incoming missiles, preventing mass urban destruction and limiting what could have become an immediate regional catastrophe. But saturation warfare does not require perfect success. It requires enough leakage to draw blood. According to the account, 11 people were killed in Israel. A hotel in Bahrain housing evacuated U.S. personnel was hit, and at logistics bases in Kuwait, 4 American soldiers were killed in direct strikes. Burning debris from successful interceptions also caused damage and casualties, a reminder that even when missile defense works, the battlefield remains lethal beneath the falling wreckage. The result was a paradox central to modern air and missile war. The region's most layered and expensive defensive architecture succeeded strategically by preventing collapse, yet still failed tactically in enough places to show vulnerability. The shield did not break, but it cracked, and the image of invulnerability cracked with it. Then came the incident that transformed battlefield complexity into outright tragedy. At 7:03 a.m. local time on March 2nd in Kuwait, inside the control station of a Patriot battery operating under extreme pressure, radar operators were reportedly nearing cognitive exhaustion. They had watched live missile attacks unfold, seen Allied positions struck, and operated in what was described as the most contaminated electromagnetic environment of the conflict. The same electronic warfare saturation that had enabled U.S. and Israeli aircraft to penetrate Iranian defenses was now interfering with identification friend or foe systems and transponder reliability across the wider battle space. In war, radio waves carry no allegiance, and the consequences of that truth were about to become catastrophic. 3 U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle aircraft returning from missions crossed Kuwaiti airspace. On the Patriot radar picture, they appeared as unidentified high-speed tracks. Under immediate threat, with doctrine pushing rapid engagement of uncertain targets, the Kuwaiti operator reportedly judged them hostile and authorized launch. The battery fired PAC-2 interceptors, missiles that destroy targets through fragmentation rather than direct collision. The warheads detonated near the aircraft, sending directional shrapnel through the sky at altitude. All 3 F-15Es had their vertical stabilizers shredded and spiraled into the desert in flames. In a rare element of pure luck amid systemic failure, all 6 aviators reportedly ejected and survived. But the message was unmistakable. Even the most advanced coalition can become dangerous to itself when the battle space is saturated with missiles, jamming, fear, and compressed decision times. By the time the smoke began to lift over the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf, satellite imagery and post-strike assessments revealed the scale of the military damage. At Chabahar, wreckage from major surface vessels reportedly lay half-submerged in darkened water. Fast attack fleets linked to Iran's asymmetric maritime strategy had been shattered. In less than 48 hours, the country's conventional navy had suffered losses so severe that analysts, in bitter military shorthand, could describe it as being transformed into a permanent fleet of stationary submarines. From a purely tactical perspective, Operation Epic Fury would be cataloged as an extraordinary success, an integrated campaign combining cyber warfare, cruise missiles, carrier aviation, stealth bombers, drone saturation, electronic attack, and precision decapitation strikes to dismantle an adversary's defenses and leadership at extraordinary speed. But warfare is not judged only by the opening blow. It is judged by what remains afterward. And what remained, according to this account, was a strategic nightmare. Approximately 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% reportedly survived the bombing campaign. Before the strikes, such material would have existed under strict centralized authority. After the decapitation of leadership and the destruction of command structures, that same fissile stockpile was no longer under one clear chain of custody. Instead, it was potentially dispersed, hidden, moved, or contested among surviving Revolutionary Guard elements, underground networks, and regional actors with divergent interests and little to lose. That raises a specter far more dangerous than the destruction of fixed infrastructure. The possibility that strategically significant nuclear material could enter a fragmented battlespace, disappear into clandestine channels, and become a commodity for black market transfer, coercive leverage, or delivery to hostile non-state actors. In that scenario, the operation would stand as both a masterpiece of warfighting and a generator of new instability on a scale impossible to fully calculate in real time. That is the core contradiction now emerging from the battlefield narrative. The United States, in this version of events, achieved what military planners often seek but rarely accomplish so completely in the first hours of a campaign: surprise, penetration, decapitation, and suppression. Iran's navy was devastated, its air defenses compromised, its political leadership shattered, and its retaliatory capacity blunted, though not eliminated. Yet the destruction of the state's head did not remove the poison from the body, it redistributed it. The region now faces not simply the aftermath of a conventional strike, but the possible beginning of a long, irregular, asymmetrical conflict driven by orphaned missile units, surviving guard commanders, black market networks, and a doctrine of revenge untethered from centralized political calculation. In military history, operations like this are often remembered first for their precision and violence. They are remembered later for the instability they unleashed. Epic fury may be recorded as one of the most effective integrated strikes of the modern era. But if the reports are correct, it may also mark the moment the Middle East entered a darker and more fragmented age.